The first thing I saw when I burst through the doors of the emergency room at Faisalabad's Allied Hospital was the stark, ghostly white of the cast on my wife's arm. It was thick and heavy, encasing her from her knuckles to her elbow, a brutal monument to an act of violence I was still struggling to comprehend. She was sitting on the edge of an examination bed, her face pale, her beautiful dark eyes wide with a mixture of shock, pain, and a simmering righteous anger. The second thing I saw was the X-ray clipped to the light box on the wall. I didn't need my 2 years of pre-med from university to understand it. The clean, ugly fracture of her ulna was as clear as a fault line in the earth, a testament to a significant, violent force. Dr. Aslam, a kind, elderly physician who was a distant family friend, put a gentle hand on my shoulder. "It's a clean break, Ali," he said, his voice a low, somber murmur. "She was lucky. Little more force, and it would have been a compound fracture. We've said it, and she's in some pain, but she will heal. Can you tell me what happened?" She said she fell, but these kinds of injuries, this is not from a simple fall. I looked at my wife Fatima, and a silent conversation passed between us. The official story, the one that would avoid immediate and catastrophic conflict, was that she had tripped over a loose paving stone in our garden. But the truth was lodged in my throat like a shard of glass, sharp and choking. The truth was that my wife, a gentle artist who found her joy in the delicate beauty of her rose garden, had had her arm broken by a pair of uniformed thugs. Oh, thugs who called themselves community enforcers. Thugs who had assaulted her for the crime of growing the wrong kind of flowers. This nightmare had begun 6 months ago. When we moved into our new home in the Sunset Garden Colony, it was one of Faisalabad's newer, more exclusive housing societies. It's a place that promised security, modernity, and peace. After years of living in the chaotic, bustling heart of Lahore, we had craved that peace. It was an architect with a growing firm, and Fatima was a celebrated textile artist. We were a quiet, modern couple seeking a sanctuary to build our life together. The house was beautiful, a contemporary design with a spacious garden that Fatima had immediately fallen in love with. The problem wasn't the house or the neighbors. It was the suffocating, almost feudal control of the Residents' Welfare Committee and its self-important chairman, Chaudhry Jamshed. Chaudhry Saab was a man from old landed wealth who believed his position as chairman of the committee gave him the authority of a local king. He was obsessed with a vision of Sunset Garden that was sterile, uniform, and completely divorced from the vibrant, chaotic beauty of our Punjabi culture. His primary instruments of control were a thick, ever-expanding book of bylaws and his newly created Toman enforcement wing. The source of our conflict, the hill upon which this war was being fought, was Fatima's garden. She had lovingly cultivated a spectacular collection of traditional roses, deep crimson damasks, fragrant pink Gula Muhammadi, and a wild rambling Desi Gulab that had been a cutting from her grandmother's ancestral home. Her garden was a riot of color, life, and fragrance, a small patch of authentic, untamed beauty. To Chaudhry Jamshed, it was an eyesore. His bylaws, which he had pushed through the committee, demanded a modern, minimalist aesthetic. This meant perfectly manicured, water-guzzling grass lawns and a few approved species of sterile, ornamental shrubs. Fatima's vibrant, traditional rose garden was a flagrant act of rebellion. The campaign of harassment had been one of escalating aggression. It started with polite but firm requests delivered by the committee's secretary, suggesting she'll consider a more modern planting scheme. When Fatima politely refused, the formal warning letters began to arrive, citing non-existent bylaws about unruly vegetation and non-compliant flora. When the letters were ignored, Chaudhry Saab dispatched his enforcers. They were 2 local toughs, a man named Rias and his sneering sidekick, Farhan, whom Chaudhry had given cheap navy blue security uniforms and the grandiose title of colony security supervisors. Their real job was not security, it was intimidation. They began a campaign of psychological warfare. They would park their motorcycle at the edge of our property for hours, just watching Fatima as she gardened. They took pictures of our home with their phones, a clear, invasive threat. They left anonymous, threatening notes in our mailbox. I had urged Fatima to be patient. I am a man who believes in process, in civilized solutions. I had filed a formal complaint with the committee, which was, of course, dismissed by its chairman. I had consulted a lawyer who had advised me that these community committees operated in a legal gray area. Their rules often unenforceable in a real court of law, but their power to harass and intimidate was very real. He had advised us to document everything, which brought us to this afternoon. I had been at my office in the city, overseeing the final drafts for a new university building. The enforcers had chosen that time to strike. They had arrived to deliver a final notice of a heavy fine for the non-removal of the rose garden. Fatima, who was in the garden tending to her beloved plants, had refused to accept the letter. She had told them, calmly but firmly, that they were trespassing on her private property and that they should leave immediately. According to the story she told me later, her refusal to be intimidated had enraged Reyes. He had tried to shove the notice into her hands. She had pulled her arm away, and he had grabbed it, refusing to let go. In the ensuing struggle, he had violently shoved her. She had lost her balance and fallen hard against the sharp stone border of the garden bed, her arm snapping with a sickening crack. The two men, seeing her on the ground, her face white with agony, had panicked and fled. Now, in the sterile quiet of the hospital room, a cold, hard rage began to solidify in my heart. My attempts at a civilized, modern approach had failed spectacularly. My wife had been physically harmed, her body broken by the agents of a petty tyrant's ego. I looked at the cast on her arm, at the tears of pain and humiliation welling in her eyes, and I knew, with an absolute and terrifying certainty, that this would not stand. I made a decision. The structures of this so-called modern, civilized society had failed to protect us. It was time to turn to an older, more fundamental system of justice. A system based not on bylaws and committees, but on the unbreakable bonds of blood and honor. I watched Fatima as she finally drifted off to sleep, aided by a powerful painkiller. I took out my phone, scrolled past my work contacts, past my city friends, past the number for our lawyer. I found the name I was looking for, a name I had not called in years. Zur, my cousin. He lived in our ancestral village, a dusty, sun-baked place in the rural heartland of Punjab, a world away from the manicured lawns and pretentious rules of Sunset Garden. He answered on the second ring, his voice a low, rumbling baritone. Zur, it's Ali, I said, my voice quiet but thick with an emotion I could not hide. Ali, Kuriyat, is everything all right, my brother? I took a deep, shuddering breath. No, I said. I have a problem. Someone put their hands on Fatima. They broke her arm. The silence on the other end of the line was not empty. It was heavy, charged with 1,000 years of unspoken family code. It was the silence of a promise being invoked. Where are you? Zur finally asked, his voice now devoid of its earlier warmth, replaced by something cold and hard as iron. Gave him the address. We're coming, he said, and the line went dead. He didn't ask for details. He didn't need them. The only detail that mattered was that a woman of his family had been harmed. The reckoning was now in motion. The arrival of my cousins was not a subtle affair. It was a declaration. It did not arrive in a quiet, respectable sedan, as was the norm in Sunset Garden. They arrived the next afternoon in a cloud of dust and a deep, earth-shaking rumble. That announced their presence long before they were seen. A dozen of them, a formidable delegation from our clan, rolled through the colony's ornate security gates on their motorcycles. They were a magnificent, intimidating sight, a stark contrast to the sterile, quiet conformity of the neighborhood. Their bikes were a mixture of classic, thumping Royal Enfields and modern, powerful Japanese touring bikes, all meticulously maintained. The men themselves were even more imposing. They were large, bearded, sun-weathered men from the country, radiating a kind of grounded, unshakable confidence that was the absolute antithesis of the insecure. Puffed-up posturing of Chaudhry Jamshed and his enforcers, they were dressed in simple, clean shalwar kameez, but they carried themselves with the quiet authority of men who knew their place in the world. A place defined by land, honor, and the unbreakable bonds of kinship. They were led by my eldest, cousin Zara, a man with a gaze as steady and serious as a hawk's. They parked their bikes in a neat, formidable line in front of my house. The sheer visual power of it, a direct challenge to the HOA's aesthetic sensibilities. Neighbors peered from behind their curtains, their faces a mixture of fear and fascination. The quiet, modern architect who lived in the corner house had just revealed a very different, very old-world side to his identity. Zariar embraced me, his large hand gentle on my back. He looked past me into the house where Fatima was resting, her arm in a sling. His expression hardened. "Tell me everything," he said. This was not to be a wave of blind, uncontrolled violence. That was not our way. This was to be a strategic, multi-pronged act of revenge. Zara and I sat on the porch, and I explained the entire situation. The bylaws, the committee, Chaudhry Jamshed, the enforcers, Riaz and Farhan, the constant harassment, the final, brutal assault. Zariar, for all his rural gravitas, possessed a keen tactical mind. He listened, nodded, and then formulated a plan. The reckoning would be delivered in phases: psychological, social, and finally, a controlled. Physical resolution, phase 1, the psychological campaign, began immediately. My cousins did not immediately confront anyone. They simply existed. They set up a temporary informal camp in my spacious yard, a constant, visible, and deeply unsettling presence. They sat on the porch in the evenings, drinking tea there. Powerful forms a silent rebuke to the colony's sterile aesthetic. They would clean their gleaming motorcycles in the driveway during the day. The scent of polish and engine oil, a stark contrast to the manicured flower beds around them. Their presence made the residents nervous. The carefully constructed authority of the Residents' Welfare Committee began to feel fragile. Its power illusory when faced with this quiet, formidable force. Phase 2, the social dismantling, was Zur's masterpiece. He was a man with a natural, commanding presence and a deep understanding of the local culture. He did not make threats. He just started talking to people. He would greet other residents during their morning walks. His demeanor polite, but his questions pointed. "Did you know the committee has hired men who break the arms of women in this colony?" He attended afternoon prayers at the local mosque, a place where Chaudhry Jamshed held considerable social sway. And he spoke quietly but firmly with the elders and other influential men of the community. He didn't raise his voice. He simply laid out the facts of the assault on his cousin's wife, a woman of their own community, and presented a copy of the official medical report from the hospital. He systematically eroded Chaudhry Jamshed's social standing from the inside out, painting him not as a leader, but as a man who employed thugs to attack women over flowers. After a week of this silent, relentless pressure, Chaudhry Jamshed was forced to act. His authority was crumbling. His neighbors were looking at him with suspicion, and his enforcers were too terrified to even patrol our street. He arrived at my house late one afternoon, his black Land Cruiser pulling up with an aggressive screech of tires. He got out, flanked by the two men who had harmed my wife Riaz and Farhan. They were trying to project an image of strength, a final attempt to re-establish their dominance. This time, however, they were not met by a lone, quiet architect. They were met by me, flanked by Zara and 10 of my other cousins who had emerged silently from the house to stand with me in the driveway. A solid, unmoving wall of family. Chaudhry Jamshed puffed out his chest. "This has gone on long enough, Khan," he blustered. "You have brought these outsiders into our peaceful community.
I demand that you and your relatives leave immediately."
Zara took a slow, deliberate step forward, and broader than Chaudhry, and his presence seemed to diminish the older man. "We will leave, Chaudhry Saab," Zariar said, his voice calm and resonant. "When two conditions are met," conditions, Chaudhry scoffed. "We are in no position to make demands. First," Zurk continued, ignoring him, "the two men who laid their hands on our sister Fatima will be handed over to us. There is a matter of honor that needs to be settled, a debt that must be paid." Riaz and Farhan paled, their earlier bravado evaporating into thin air. "And second," Zur said, his eyes locking onto Chaudhry's, "the Residents' Welfare Committee, This body that gives you the perceived authority to terrorize women will be permanently disbanded. The residents can form a new one, a better one, if they choose. But your reign is over. This is insane. I will do no such thing, Chaudhry roared. Riaz, Farhan, deal with them. The two enforcers, trapped between their employer's foolish pride and the wall of silent imposing men before them, hesitated. That hesitation cost them. It wasn't a brawl. It was a swift, brutal, and efficient demonstration of overwhelming force. Zajar and two of my other cousins moved with a speed that was shocking. Riaz was disarmed of his bravado with a single, open-handed slap that echoed through the quiet street. Farhan found himself lifted off his feet and deposited unceremoniously into a large, thorny bougainvillea bush.
Yes.
It was over in seconds. There was no real fight, only a clear, undeniable statement. You were outmatched. Faced with this humiliating reality, Chaudhry Jamshed's power evaporated completely. The other residents who had been watching from their windows now began to emerge. Their fear of the committee replaced by a simmering anger at the man who had brought this chaos upon them. The police were called, but by the time they arrived, it was a messy situation with a dozen conflicting stories. However, Fatima's official medical report of a broken arm was a hard, undeniable fact. The two enforcers, with multiple witnesses now willing to speak against them, were arrested for assault. Chaudhry Jamshed was disgraced, was forced to resign in a furious emergency meeting of the residents, his name now a symbol of arrogant failure. The Residents' Welfare Committee was, as Zara had demanded, dissolved and later replaced by a more reasonable and far less powerful advisory body. A week later, my cousins finally left, their mission accomplished. They mounted their motorcycles, the engines roaring to life in a chorus of triumphant power. Zarar embraced me one last time. "Remember, brother," he said, his voice warm again. "You are never alone." They rode off in a cloud of dust, leaving a profound and lasting quiet in their wake. Fatima and I stood on our porch, her arm now healing in its cast. Her rose garden was safe, her home was secure. The peace we had sought had been restored not by modern rules or legal letters, but by an older, more fundamental code, a powerful reminder that the truest community is not the one defined by walls and bylaws, but by the unbreakable bonds of family and honor.